What happens when a boss secretly returns to his own bakery and discovers that his name has been turned into a joke on every loaf of bread? The afternoon rain poured over the city like a heavy gray curtain, each drop striking the glass windows with weight, blurring the dim yellow glow of the streetlights outside. Adrian Blake stood in front of the glass door of the bakery that bore his name, his dark coat soaked through, the hood pulled low over his face. He exhaled slowly, his eyes resting on the old, worn-out sign, its paint peeling in patches, a sight he had never allowed when he still ran this place. With a quiet sigh, he pushed the door open, the small bell above ringing weakly, sounding almost lost in the heavy silence. The smell of stale frying oil mixed with over-baked bread filled his nose. Nothing like the warm, inviting aroma that once had people lining up around the block during the bakery's early years. None of the staff turned to look at him, not a single greeting. Adrian walked in slowly, his wet shoes sticking slightly to the dirty tile floor as his eyes swept over everything. Wobbly tables and chairs, napkins scattered on the ground, a light on the ceiling flickering weakly as if fighting off its final breath. Every detail cut into him like a blade, a bitter reminder that the dream he had poured half his life into had been left to rot. He stepped up to the counter, where a young woman with her hair tied in a high ponytail, her name tag reading Lana, sat hunched over her phone, fingers scrolling rapidly without once looking up. Adrian spoke softly, masking his tone like any other customer. "Turkey rye, extra mustard." Lana nodded lazily, jotting it down with her eyes still glued to the screen. Adrian pulled his hood lower and stepped aside, quietly observing every sound, every expression like a meticulous inspector. The faint clatter of cutlery, the soft sighs of customers, the hushed complaints of an elderly couple waiting at the next table all blended into a heavy, lifeless atmosphere, stripped of the warmth that once defined this bakery. A few minutes later, Lana slid the plate onto the counter, her voice flat. "Here you go." Adrian stepped forward, his hand brushing the chipped ceramic plate. But what caught his eye wasn't the toasted rye bread or the slices of turkey. It was two words written in garish yellow mustard across the top of the sandwich. Adrian Blake. Time seemed to freeze for a few seconds. His breath caught, his eyes locked on the words as if staring at his own heart being torn apart. The sharp scent of mustard rose from the sandwich, but what stung wasn't the smell. It was the raw humiliation spelled out before him. Lana burst out laughing, her voice laced with open mockery. "You know, no one actually orders that. They call it the worst thing on the menu. Named after the old owner. Word is he's just some washed-up loser sitting somewhere enjoying his retirement." From the back kitchen, a dry laugh followed, another voice chiming in with a sneer. "Yeah, his name only lives on because of that lousy sandwich now." Adrian stood still, his gloved fingers curling into a fist, the knuckles tightening under the damp leather. His mind flickered back to the early days, the freezing morning spent in a rusty old food truck, his hands blistered from hot oil, and the joyful smiles of customers lining up just to taste his perfectly baked rye. He had believed he'd passed that pride on to the people working here now, but that pride had been turned into a cheap joke. Another laugh rang out as Lana turned back, shaking her head. "Seriously, who even remembers him anymore? Just an outdated legend, that's all." Adrian inhaled deeply, placed the sandwich back on the counter, and said nothing. He turned and walked slowly to a corner of the shop, where a dim light cast shadows across walls that had once been painted in warm, welcoming colors, now dulled and stained. Sitting down on a rickety wooden chair, he pulled his hood even lower, his eyes fixed on every move they made. But these weren't the eyes of a customer anymore. They were the eyes of a wolf, silent and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The rain outside continued to patter against the glass, a steady, cold rhythm that only deepened the lifeless atmosphere inside the bakery. Adrian Blake sat quietly in a shadowed corner, his hood pulled low to hide half his face, his hands resting calmly on the table, though his eyes missed nothing. 10 years ago, This place had been alive with energy, so busy that customers waited in long lines just to get a table. Laughter and words of thanks had once filled the air, making his heart swell with pride as the staff moved quickly, their footsteps matching the heartbeat of his dream. But now, the bakery felt like a corpse clinging to life, its tables and chairs scattered, stains spreading across the floor, napkins littered carelessly, and ceiling lights flickering in weak, uneven pulses. Adrian's gaze shifted toward the counter. An elderly couple sat near the window, their eyes darting to the clock repeatedly, their faces etched with fatigue. The husband coughed lightly before murmuring, "Let's wait a little longer, dear." His wife only nodded, her sad eyes staring down at the table. Their order had been waiting for over 20 minutes, yet no one seemed to care. Behind the counter, Lana sat hunched over her phone, scrolling through her screen as if checking social media was her only job. A middle-aged man approached, his voice tense. "Excuse me, my order's been nearly 30 minutes. Could you—" Lana cut him off, not even glancing up. "Just wait, the kitchen's busy." The man sighed and returned to his seat. The door opened, and Ethan Cole walked in. He wore a wrinkled white shirt, polished shoes, and a shiny name tag that read "Manager." His smile stretched unnaturally wide, but his eyes were empty. Ethan strode to the counter, patting Lana on the shoulder, scanning the room before his eyes landed on Adrian. His expression shifted instantly into a polite, customer-friendly grin. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm the manager here, Ethan Cole. You're lucky today we're running everything smoothly." His voice dropped slightly as if sharing a secret. "I guarantee you'll be satisfied. We run a very tight system." Adrian gave a slight nod, silent, his face calm though anger churned inside. Oblivious to who he was speaking to, Ethan continued, "You know, people still talk about Adrian Blake like he's some legend. But come on, he's probably sitting on some yacht right now, laughing at all the money he made off this brand. We're the ones keeping everything alive now." He chuckled softly, his tone dripping with mockery. From the kitchen, another voice joined in, loud and scornful. "Yeah, his name only lives on in that awful sandwich. Nobody even remembers him anymore." Dry laughter followed, mixed with the clang of metal pans. Lana smirked, not even trying to hide it. Adrian stayed perfectly still, his hood shadowing his face, but under the table, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. Memories flashed through his mind, the morning spent repainting these very walls himself, wiping every table before opening, lifting hot, freshly baked loaves as if they were his firstborn child. He had believed he left this place in the hands of people who would protect its values. Now it had been reduced to a mockery. Quietly, Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn black notebook. He opened it, his handwriting precise, deliberate, and cold. Branch 47, Walking Corpse. He pressed the pen hard, drawing a bold line beneath the words, then closed the notebook slowly. His eyes lifted, settling on Ethan, who was laughing casually, completely unaware. In the depth of Adrian's gaze, a cold glint sparked not just disappointment, but the steely resolve of a man ready to tear down every layer of this illusion, no matter what it took. The rain outside continued to tap against the glass, its steady cold rhythm adding weight to the suffocating air inside the bakery, as if every breath carried the stale taste of old grease. Adrian Blake sat in the same corner as before, his hands resting loosely on the closed black notebook, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hood, missing nothing. He was silent, but each small detail was assembling itself in his mind into a complete picture of decay. Near the counter, Kyle Cole, a young man with messy hair and a wrinkled uniform, slouched back against the wall, his legs propped arrogantly on a chair. One hand held his phone, the other casually lifted a vape to his mouth. Thin white smoke curled toward the ceiling, mixing with the smell of baked bread and old oil, thickening the already oppressive air. No one said a word to him. No one dared. Lana glanced at Kyle with a crooked smirk. "Careful, if a customer sees—" Kyle cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Who's going to say anything to me? My uncle owns this place." As if to confirm it, Ethan Cole walked out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dirty rag, his eyes briefly settling on Kyle with an approving look, as if nothing about the scene was wrong. Ethan strode past the counter, ignoring waiting customers, and stopped beside Maria, the only employee in the entire place who seemed to be working seriously. Maria Alvarez, small-framed with her hair tied back neatly, moved methodically as she wiped down tables with a damp cloth. Her face showed exhaustion, but every motion carried a carefulness the others had long abandoned. Ethan stepped closer, smirking, placing a hand on Maria's back. She flinched slightly, her posture stiffening instinctively. He leaned in, his voice low and suggestive. "You're doing great, Maria, but don't overdo it. I don't want the others getting upset because you're making them look bad." Maria shifted, trying to pull away, but Ethan didn't remove his hand. His fingers tapped lightly against her back, a silent warning. "Play along, and I'll keep you on extra shifts. Understand?" Maria bit her lip, nodding slightly, her face turning away, her eyes filled with quiet fear and helplessness. No one else in the shop paid attention, or rather, no one dared. Lana stayed glued to her phone. Kyle blew another thick ring of smoke at the ceiling, grinning smugly. Adrian drew a long breath, his fist tightening under the table, his knuckles turning white again. In his mind, a familiar alarm rang loud, the same instinct that had once saved him from deceitful business partners. This was no longer laziness or poor management. This was rot, deep, corrosive rot eating away at what was once the soul of this place. He slowly slid the black notebook back into view, flipped it open, and with deliberate sharp strokes wrote 3 words across the page. Nepotism, harassment, exploitation. The last word was underlined twice, the heavy ink cutting into the paper like a blade. Ethan finally moved away from Maria, walking back toward Kyle, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, kid. I'm here. No one's going to touch you." Kyle laughed loudly, his voice echoing through the bakery like a dare to anyone who might challenge him. Adrian lifted his head, his gaze locking on the two of them. The calmness was gone from his eyes. What burned there now wasn't the detached observation of an owner quietly assessing his staff. It was the focused intensity of a predator who had chosen his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In that instant, as Ethan and Kyle laughed carelessly, Adrian understood something with chilling clarity. This bakery wasn't just being neglected, it was being killed from the inside out by the very people wearing name tags with his brand on them. And from this moment, Adrian knew one thing with absolute certainty. Their names were now etched onto a list he would never forgive. The morning sky hung heavy with gray clouds, as if a storm was waiting to break loose at any moment. Adrian Blake stepped out of the hotel, but he no longer looked like the same man from the night before. The long, dark coat was replaced with a light gray shirt, slightly worn and clipped to his chest was a plastic badge that read Health Department Inspector, complete with an official-looking ID he had hastily prepared overnight. A worn black briefcase was tucked under his arm, and behind the thin-framed glasses, his eyes held the cold, sharp focus of someone used to exposing others' mistakes. His steps were firm and deliberate, each one landing with the weight of an unspoken warning. The bell above the glass door chimed softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air still reeked of old frying oil, now mixed with the faint sourness of wilted vegetables drifting from the kitchen. Adrian's brow furrowed not with the disappointment of an owner, but with the disgust of an inspector on duty. Lana glanced up briefly, her eyes widening with unease when she saw his badge, and she quickly straightened up. "Sir, what do you need?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. His voice, when it came, was cold and commanding. "I need to inspect the entire facility. Open the kitchen." There was no room for hesitation in his tone. Lana looked around nervously, then reluctantly unlocked the swinging door to the back. The moment Adrian stepped through, he paused, his body tensing as every muscle tightened with anger he had to bury beneath his guise. The kitchen was a disaster. The floor was slick with grease, streaked with dried footprints. Wooden cutting boards sat damp and covered in crumbs and browned vegetable scraps. A tray of lettuce in the corner sagged, its leaves wilted, some turning yellow, with murky water collecting at the bottom, releasing a faint sour smell. A half-toasted loaf of bread sat forgotten on a counter, small flies buzzing lazily around it. By the sink, an old knife, its blade coated with a thin layer of rust, lay beside a tray of cold cuts. Worst of all, a half-eaten sandwich sat discarded right next to raw meat on a cutting board. Adrian set the briefcase on a stainless steel counter and pulled out a pair of thin gloves. Running a gloved finger along the metal surface, he lifted it to eye level, revealing a smear of grease and dust clinging stubbornly to his fingertip. His eyes were void of any expression, as cold and sharp as a freshly honed blade. A young cook nearby, Miguel, the only one who seemed to be working seriously, froze when Adrian's gaze swept over him. Adrian's voice was steady, almost detached, but every word landed like an order. "Is this your standard of operation?" Miguel swallowed hard, starting to speak, but before he could answer, a familiar voice came from behind. Ethan Cole walked in, his face briefly tightening before melting into a forced smile. "Ah, good morning. We weren't informed of this inspection." Adrian turned his head, his gaze cutting through Ethan's fake grin like glass. "And it seems you haven't prepared to follow basic sanitation laws either." Ethan let out a strained laugh, folding his arms. "You know how it is. Busy shop, we keep everything under control, but right now..." Adrian cut him off, pulling a fabricated inspection report from his briefcase and slamming it onto the counter. The sound of paper hitting metal echoed harshly in the tense kitchen. "I'll be documenting everything. If this is a regular condition, this place will be subject to a full investigation next week. And trust me, I won't be the only one coming." Ethan stiffened, his smile disappearing. Just then, Lana's voice carried in from the counter, lowered but loud enough for Adrian to hear. "Ethan, you said yesterday not to worry, inspector or not, as long as revenue was good, right?" Silence followed for a beat before Ethan snapped, shouting, "Shut up!" But it was too late. Adrian's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time there was no trace of the detached inspector in his stare. There was only the sharp, predatory gleam of the real owner seeing his name dragged through filth. He slipped a phone out from the briefcase, quietly pressing the record button. Ethan's voice was already captured clearly enough. Adjusting the hidden camera to capture the entire kitchen, Adrian turned back, his tone calm but icy. "I'll be back, and next time no excuse in the world will save you." The next afternoon, the sky had cleared slightly, but the air inside the bakery was still thick with laziness and neglect. Adrian Blake walked in looking like a completely different man. His usual shirt had been swapped for a wrinkled gray suit jacket, his collar intentionally askew, and clipped to his chest was a plastic badge that read Marcus Financial Consultant, hanging loosely as if hastily put on. A thick folder of documents was tucked under his arm, and he moved with the weary confidence of a mid-level office worker looking for investment opportunities. His performance was flawless. Nobody paid him much attention, save for a few curious glances from customers. He chose a table near the counter, close enough to hear every word. Kyle Cole leaned lazily against the counter, chewing gum and scrolling on his phone. Ethan Cole passed by, patting Kyle's shoulder with a smile that carried an unspoken secret, the kind of look shared between people hiding something. Adrian observed them carefully, his cold eyes hidden behind the indifferent gaze of a stranger. All it would take was the right push, and that secret would spill out. Pretending to jot down numbers in his folder, Adrian approached the counter and asked a question designed to spark pride. His tone was curious, almost impressed. "Excuse me, I heard this is the best performing branch in the system. I'm looking into investments in the food industry. What's your secret? What's so special about how this place is run?" Kyle immediately looked up, his eyes lighting up with smugness. He glanced at Ethan, then leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough for Adrian to hear. "Special? Oh yeah, this place is different. We know how to move money." Adrian raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly as if intrigued. "Move money? What do you mean by that?" Kyle smirked, clearly pleased with himself. "Come on, man, if you don't get it, you don't get it. But since you look like a finance guy, you'll understand. Every month, we've got about 6 remote workers on the payroll paid every week, like clockwork. But here's the thing, they don't exist. We call it the technical support list, but it's just family." 24 grand a year, straight into the pockets of people who actually deserve it, like my uncle. Adrian forced a laugh, his tone laced with admiration. Sounds clever. Corporate doesn't check? Kyle shrugged, grinning with arrogance. Are you kidding? Corporate thinks the real boss is dead somewhere. Adrian Blake? His name's just a brand now, a sticker to print money. As long as revenue's good, who cares? The words stabbed into Adrian like a knife, but his expression didn't change. He nodded slightly, feigning agreement. Right. As long as the profit's there, nobody cares. Honestly, I admire how you guys run this place. Kyle laughed out loud, convinced he had just impressed a potential investor. Adrian returned to his seat, pretending to take more notes, but his phone was already recording every word. Each sentence Kyle uttered was another piece of evidence. When he had gathered enough, Adrian stood, casually walking out. The moment he stepped past the door, he pulled out his phone. That night, in his hotel room, his laptop glowed in the dim light as he organized the audio files. Each name Kyle had bragged about was cross-referenced with old financial data. 6 names repeated over and over: Brandon Hollister Jr., Jennifer Walsh, Mike Torres, David Kim, Marcus Reed, and one entirely fabricated name with no tax record. The total matched Kyle's boast perfectly, $24,000 a year. Adrian opened his black notebook, writing one sharp line across the page, each letter etched as if carved into stone. Systemic corruption dead list. He drew a long, hard line under it, then closed the book, his eyes fixed on the figures glowing on his laptop screen. There was no hesitation left in him now. They hadn't just killed the soul of this brand, they had turned it into a tool for outright theft. And from this moment forward, Adrian was done watching. Outside, the city lights flickered to life, casting golden reflections across rain-slicked streets. Adrian sat still in the darkness, the only light in the room coming from the laptop screen. His eyes were sharp, his breathing slow, steady, like a predator moments before a strike. He whispered to himself, voice low, almost a growl meant only for him. Tomorrow, they'll know who really owns this place. That morning, the sky was unnaturally clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds and reflecting off rain puddles still lingering from the night before. But for Adrian Blake, it wasn't just another morning, it was Judgment Day. He stood before the hotel mirror, his hands calm as they smoothed the charcoal gray suit, adjusted his tie, and fastened the final button with a decisive motion. No more hoods, no more hiding. The man staring back at him was the man he had always been: CEO, founder, and, more importantly, the true owner of it all. Adrian stepped out of the hotel, his polished leather shoes tapping steadily against the pavement, each step a warning. Outside the bakery, the neon sign still flickered weakly. He drew in a deep breath and pushed open the door. The soft chime that rang out wasn't lost in the air this time. Every head in the room turned. At first, no one recognized him. To them, he was just a sharply dressed man radiating quiet authority. But then, Maria Alvarez, wiping down a table near the window, froze. Her eyes widened, her hand trembled, and the rag slipped from her fingers. "It's him," she whispered, voice trembling. The words spread like a ripple through the room. Ethan Cole, standing near the counter mid-conversation with Kyle, stiffened, his face drained of color, his forced smile sliding away. Kyle glanced up, panic flickering in his eyes as he shoved his phone into his pocket. Lana stood frozen behind the counter, her phone slipping from her hand with a loud, dry clack. Adrian said nothing, walking steadily toward the center of the room. Each step was heavy, the sound of his shoes striking the tiled floor like a hammer in the tense silence. Stopping in the middle, he placed a thick black notebook on the main table, turning it so everyone could see. His gaze swept over them cold, calm, but sharp enough to cut through steel, forcing every set of eyes downward. Then his voice filled the room, low and controlled, every word landing like a blow. "Ethan Cole, Kyle Cole, Lana Brooks, 6 ghost employees on your payroll, $24,000 stolen from this system every year. You've turned this, He pointed toward the counter, where the once famous rye sandwich had been reduced to a joke, into a mockery to line your pockets. The air grew heavier. Ethan stumbled back a step, his voice shaking. "Mr. Blake, let me explain. This isn't—" Adrian cut him off, his tone sharp as steel. "You don't need to explain. I've heard enough. I've seen enough." His gaze locked onto Kyle. "You were proud of this scam, weren't you? You bragged about it to a stranger, not realizing that stranger was me. You signed your own sentence with your own words." Maria swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. But for the first time, it wasn't fear, it was hope. She wasn't the rot. She wasn't part of the disease. Adrian gave a subtle nod. Two men in black suits entered the bakery immediately, silent and efficient. One grabbed Ethan by the arm, the other blocked Kyle as he tried to slip toward the back door. "Don't touch me!" Kyle yelled, struggling, but the sharp click of handcuffs silenced him. Ethan dropped to his knees, desperation in his eyes. "Please, Mr. Blake, I was just trying to keep this place running." Adrian's eyes didn't soften. "Running by stealing, harassing, and bleeding dry what I built on trust? You killed what this place stood for, and I don't forgive people like you." The door swung open again as the security team escorted Ethan and Kyle out. Lana shrank behind the counter, her face pale, hands trembling. Adrian barely looked at her. His words were clipped, final. "You'll be leaving too, today." When the door closed, the silence in the bakery was suffocating. Only Maria, Miguel, and a few quiet employees remained. Adrian turned back, his gaze no longer icy, but still firm. "From this moment on, this place changes. Those who truly want to do things right will stay. If not, leave now." Maria lowered her head, her eyes shimmering with tears, but this time she smiled. For the first time in a long while, a spark of light had returned. The air in the bakery after Ethan and Kyle were taken away was heavy, like a storm had just passed, leaving behind a tense, bewildered silence. A few customers remained seated, their curious eyes following every movement, but no one dared to speak. Adrian Blake stood at the center of the room, the black notebook still open on the table, its harsh words laid out like a verdict for those who had just been removed. But this time, his voice was different, steady, warm, carrying the weight of a promise rather than a sentence. "Those of you who are still here." His gaze moved slowly across the room, pausing on Maria, then on Miguel. "If you truly want to keep this place alive, if you still believe in what it once stood for, everything changes starting today." He walked to the counter, placing a white porcelain plate on it. On the plate was the famous rye sandwich, his name written across it in bright yellow mustard, the same sandwich that had been mocked and turned into a joke. He looked at it for a moment, his voice dropping lower. This name was never meant to be a punchline. It used to be a symbol of pride, and it will be that again. Maria stood near the window, still holding a rag, her hands trembling slightly. When Adrian turned to her, she lowered her head, her eyes glistening with emotion. He walked slowly toward her, his tone calm but unwavering. "Maria Alvarez, you kept this place alive. You were the only one who treated customers as more than just a nuisance. You should have been recognized long ago." Maria looked up, her eyes red, her voice shaky. "I was just doing my job, sir." Adrian cut her off gently but firmly. "No, you did more than that. And I won't let someone like you go unnoticed for another minute. Starting today, you are the assistant manager of this branch." Maria froze, her hands trembling, her eyes filling with tears. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I don't deserve this." Adrian looked straight into her eyes and gave a small nod. "You've deserved it for a long time." A single tear rolled down Maria's cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from hope. Adrian then turned toward the kitchen, where Miguel stood stiffly, both hands clutching a rag as if bracing for a verdict. Adrian stepped closer, his voice strong and commanding. "Miguel Santos, I know you're the reason this kitchen hasn't turned into a health hazard. I've seen how hard you've tried to do things right, even when no one cared. Starting today, you are the head chef. I want this kitchen as clean and proud as it was the day I first opened it." Miguel swallowed hard, nodding slowly, his grip on the rag tightening until his knuckles turned white. His eyes shone with pride and quiet emotion. "I won't let you down, Mr. Blake." Adrian gave a single approving nod, then turned to the rest of the staff standing quietly in the corner. "As for the rest of you, if you want to stay, you start fresh from this moment. If not, leave now. I won't keep anyone who only stood by and watched this place fall apart." No one moved toward the door. Instead, one by one, they nodded silently, and for the first time in years, there was a spark of pride in their eyes. Adrian pulled a large envelope from his case and placed it on the table. "This is the money stolen from the system. I've taken it directly from the compensation they owe. It will go to those whose hours were cut unfairly." Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. Miguel stood frozen, his lips trembling as he tried to find words. Adrian continued, his tone firm but resolute. "I'm not just taking back my name. I'm restoring the honor of everyone who ever did things the right way in this place." The customers, who had witnessed everything, began to clap. The sound grew, echoing through the bakery that had long been filled only with sarcastic laughter and complaints. Maria raised a hand to cover her mouth, her shoulders trembling, and whispered softly, "Thank you. Thank you for coming back." Adrian didn't respond, only gave a slight nod. But in his eyes, for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of satisfaction, not for himself, but for the people who still believed in what his name truly stood for. The first morning after everything changed, sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of the bakery, casting warm rays across the freshly polished wooden tables. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, the same aroma that had once been the soul of this place, now returned like a promise that life here was beginning again. Customers entered with looks of surprise mixed with delight, some whispering to each other in disbelief that in just one night the shop could feel so different. Adrian Blake stood behind the counter, his white shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, an apron tied firmly around his waist. This was a far cry from the stern CEO of the previous day, no longer a man issuing orders, but one who was working with his own hands, just as he had in the early years when everything started from a worn-out food truck. Hands once used to handling meetings and financial reports were now holding a sponge, washing each plate, each glass with meticulous care. Water trickled softly, soap bubbles clung to his fingers, but Adrian paid no attention. Every movement was deliberate, as if he were scrubbing the very honor of his name clean again. Maria passed by the counter, pausing for a moment, still unable to fully comprehend the sight of her boss washing dishes. She wanted to say something but stopped, simply offering a small smile, her eyes shining with a newfound trust. Miguel stood near the kitchen door, arms folded, his face serious but his eyes glowing with quiet pride. A young employee whispered to a colleague in the corner, He's really back to work with us." The other only nodded slightly, eyes glistening. Adrian placed the last plate on the drying rack, dried his hands with a clean white towel, and slowly untied the apron. He looked around the shop. Tables were spotless. Customers smiled as they were served quickly and attentively, and the staff behind the counter stood straighter, their eyes focused with renewed dedication. Adrian gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at his lips, not a smile of victory, but of coming home. On the wall behind the counter, a new frame had been hung. Inside was a photo of the famous rye sandwich, the name Adrian Blake, written in golden mustard. Beneath it, a small plaque was engraved with the words, "This name is not a joke, it is a reminder, never forget why we started." Adrian stood before the picture for a long moment, his eyes deep, as if speaking to the version of himself from 10 years ago, the young man who once worked behind a battered food truck, his hands burned from hot oil, but his heart full of hope. He turned back to the counter, where Maria was preparing the next order. She looked up, her eyes glistening but shining with a brightness he hadn't seen before. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you not just for saving this place, but for believing in us." Adrian smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice low but unwavering. I don't just believe in you, Maria. I believe this place, all of us can be better every day. And from now on, I won't leave it again. The door swung open, and the first customers of the morning stepped in, the gentle ring of the bell carrying a new sense of life. Adrian rolled up his sleeves once more, stepping to the counter to stand alongside Maria and Miguel. Greeting the customers with a warm smile, his voice carried both pride and sincerity. Welcome to Caldwell's Corner. For the first time in years, the name was spoken with pride, not ridicule. As the shop grew lively, Adrian cast one last glance at the photo on the wall, silently promising, I'm back, and this time, I'll stay so no one will ever turn this into a joke again. A business only truly exists when the people behind the counter still carry pride in the name they represent. Adrian Blake not only reclaimed his own honor, but he also reminded us that true leadership begins with the courage to stand alongside even the smallest people. If you also believe that a name should inspire pride, not shame, then hit like and subscribe to help share these stories of positive change. And don't forget to leave a comment with the 3 words, keep the faith, because that is exactly what keeps every value standing strong.